Morning. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit about why we would grow grapes in the garden and then their general needs and variety selection. So let's get started. Stuart, do you want to advance to the next slide? So there's many reasons why we would want to grow grapes in the garden. They have a long history, over 8,000 years, we know for sure, in that they are an ancient crop, and there have even been depictions of grape harvests found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. So grapes have been around for a very long time. We often see them used fresh or in jams, pies, juiced, and then wines as well. Today we're focusing on table grapes. Grapes are actually the most consumed fresh fruit in the world, and California grows 99% of our country's commercially grown table grapes. But Washington State is a major producer of grapes for juice. So even in our own state, grapes are an important crop. And they're fantastic to share with other people. And one grapevine can yield 15 to 35 pounds of fruit annually, depending on the variety. So that's a lot of fruit that you would be harvesting each year. They're also really pretty to look at in your yard, so they become a nice addition to your landscape, whether you have them growing along a fence, trellised, or growing over an arbor. Really, your possibilities of how you want to grow your grapes are endless, and Stuart's going to show us more about that later. And lastly, they grow well in our climate. Many table grapes are actually native varieties to North America, so they're well suited to our climates. Most of our wine grapes that we know of are of European origin, and so they have different issues that come along with that when we try to grow them here in America or in the Willamette Valley. Grapes require a warm growing season. That means 150 to 180 frost-free days, and our area here in the Willamette Valley can provide that. So as you're looking to start with grapes, everyone has a different reason why they might want to add them, but here's just a few for us to consider. Next. So there are many things to think about when you're looking at putting grapes into your landscape. First, you're going to want to know a variety that you're going to want to purchase. You want to know how they grow as a plant, where they need to be placed in your landscape to be successful, how to actually plant them, and then the care that they're going to need, because grapes do need attention throughout the year. So taking the time to think through each of those steps is all very important. It helps set you up for success in the long run. And so I'm going to go over these before we head into pruning. Next. So where I always like to start is the varieties. What do I want to grow? There are 10,000 varieties of grapes around the globe. That's a lot of choices. So how would I know which one is appropriate for me in my backyard or you in your backyard? So the first step is to know your climate. Know where you're going to be growing your grapes. If you're in North Clark County, up in Amboy or Yakult, you might be dealing with cooler winters than someone who's living down along the Columbia River. Or you can even have microclimates in your yard where there's changes from your garden to the neighbor's garden based on trees or fences or other areas that make one area of your landscape colder or more frosty than the neighbor. So pay attention, do some observations and research. There are different grape varieties have different requirements when it comes to growing, what are called growing degree days. In short, growing degree days is the difference between the daily average temperature and a base temperature of 50 degrees for a given area. There's a whole relatively simple mathematical formula to figure that out, or you could just consult a chart. So for example, Portland's growing degree days is 2,455. And Yakima's, by comparison, is 3,097. These numbers are important when it comes to the ripening of your fruit. So some cultivars, like the well-known Concords, require a minimum of 2,000 GDDs to ripen. So we're right on that cusp of some years we would have enough growing degree days for Concords to ripen, and some years we might be cutting it a little short. So it's also important to research a particular variety's disease and cold tolerance. And then also realizing that varieties have different ripening times. They're going to be labeled or categorized as early, mid, or late varieties. Late season varieties like the Concords I had mentioned would ripen mid-October, which for us is bumping right up to some cooler temperatures. So by comparison, you might want to choose an early season variety, and those would ripen 4 to 5 weeks before Concord. So that would be early to mid-September. And lastly, what I think is maybe one of the important things is taste. Do you actually like the variety that you're choosing? So I always encourage you to try it before you buy it. See if you can track that variety down and sample it. Next slide, please. So just to give an example, I know these are a lot of varieties, but these are just a few of the over 40 recommended table grapes for the Willamette Valley. And any of these here that have an asterisk are ones that we are planting at the Heritage Farm demonstration gardens. And so just in the future, if you can come on property and see those, you would get a good idea of what those varieties look like. But other things to notice, there are many different colors that are available: green, red, and blue, and even white grape varieties. There are differing seasons. There's the early, mid, late varieties are all available, and different flavors. You'll notice it says, often you might hear an American grape variety described as having a foxy or musky flavor. And those are kind of, a foxy flavor seems like an odd way to describe how something tastes. The best example of that would be if you've ever had a glass of pure Concord grape juice. That taste is what sets apart the American varieties versus some of the European varieties. So if you think of a Concord grape, that's what they're talking about, that kind of candy-like, strong, true grape flavor. So thinking about taste, it's important that you actually like the taste of what you're growing. So I recommend trying to find area tastings. If you can go to often in the fall, you'll find those for apples and pears and grapes, and you can go and sample some different varieties of grapes. If a neighbor or a family member has grapes growing in their landscape, ask them if you can sample some of those when they're in season. Also try visiting local farmers markets. You might find different varieties sold there that would allow you to sample different types. Lastly, look for regional publications, either from Washington State University or Oregon State University, for recommended lists of varieties. As I've mentioned, this list here on the slide is just a small sampling of the many different types that we can grow in our area. Next, please. So once you have an idea of which variety or varieties you want to grow, it's important to understand how the grape plant grows itself. So a grapevine is a woody perennial. They do best in full sun, and by full sun, I mean 8 or more hours a day. So when you're looking for a site in your yard, you need to know that it's going to be truly a full sun area. Grapes do accept a wide variety of soils, from really not super fertile soil all the way up to fertile soil. So they're pretty forgiving in that manner. They do have flowers and fruit on new shoots, and this photo here is a good example of their non-showy flowers. So they're not like a cherry tree that's in bloom and looks really pretty. They kind of have these nondescript flowers. They are pollinated primarily by wind, but also sometimes insects will help pollination along. And they're self-pollinating. So if you really only wanted to grow one grapevine, you can do that. You do not need multiple grapevines in your landscape to get fruit. But lastly, also remember that they do, because they're vigorous growers, they need to be pruned annually and trained. You need to tell them where they can grow, essentially. Thank you. Next slide. So this is going to show a basic diagram of a grapevine and how it grows. You're going to see the trunk there, that's the woody part of the vine, that remains every single year from the time you first plant and you select which vine will become the plant or become the trunk, that stays there and becomes more woody and trunk-like, like what you would expect, and it grows in diameter each year. At the top of the trunk is what's called the head of the trunk, and that's where the vine transitions to either canes or cordons, depending on your pruning and training methods. So this picture here shows a cordon trained vine, and cordons are essentially extensions of the trunk. So they will become, they're canes that are allowed to stay on the training wire, and they will become woodier as time goes on. A cane is a mature shoot after harvest. So essentially, every year, your grapevine will put out shoots, and in year one, they're called a shoot. And then after harvest, once the leaves have fallen, any shoots that remain, those are now called canes. They go into this transition of becoming a new name. In the spring, early on, new shoots will grow from buds that are along the canes or spurs, and sometimes even the trunks. Shoots will grow leaves and flowers, which then become your future fruit. You can have sucker growth or water sprouts down along the trunk, and those are something you will want to remove. Typically, when they're under 12 inches long, you just go and snip them off or pull them off if they're small enough. You really want your shoots to be growing along your spurs or your canes and not along your trunk. Grape buds themselves are a compound bud, which all that means is that each grape bud has the potential to grow 1 to 3 shoots every year, or each bud does that. So 1 to 3 shoots per grape bud means that early in the summer or late spring, you're going to be doing some thinning, because if you have 3 shoots coming from one bud, that gets very thick, and you're going to want to open up the canopy. So Stuart will explain a little bit more of that later on. And so all of this growth, canes coming out, and shoots and everything that can happen in a grapevine, you can see why annual pruning is important. Growth that is 3, 4, 5 or more years old, so those of us who maybe purchased a property with a grapevine on it that's been neglected, those are not very productive at all, because all of our fruit is on current season growth. So anything that's older is going to be needing to be cut off. And so we're also going to be discussing how to renovate those old vines. Next. So you have a variety selected and you understand how the grape plant grows. Now you need to choose where to place it in your yard. And this is another important step in growing your grapevines. You really need to think about your space, the sun exposure, the airflow in that area, the soil. All of those things are important pieces to growing your grapevine successfully. It's something that it's hard to think about or visualize, but we need to also remember that grapevines are a long-lived plant, 50 to 100 years. So me, at my age, if I were to put a grape plant in the ground now, it's going to outlive me. So I really want to think about where I'm putting that in my garden. They're also vigorous growers. So look far around from where you plan on planting. What is nearby? Are there trees nearby? A neighbor's shed? Anything like that? These long growing vines can grow up into trees, over into neighbors' sheds. My grapevines got a little out of control one year, and I came out in my backyard and I saw my neighbor sadly having to throw the vines from my grape plant that had been growing up onto the roof of his shed back over onto my side of the yard. So needless to say, I went out later that day and did a little mid-season pruning just to keep them in our yard and contained. So a healthy grapevine will take up a minimum of 50 square feet of space. That's quite a bit. And in rich soil, they can grow even more vigorously. 75 to 100 square feet would be needed for that grapevine. So depending on your variety and the vigor of that variety and the soil you're growing in can determine the size of this plant. So some of us who might need to visualize what that looks like, take a tape measure out to that site where you're thinking about planting and measure it all out so you can really see what does this look like when it's mature. Because when you plant that little, what essentially looks like a little stick into the ground, it's hard to imagine something that can take up so much space. It's also important to take the time to prep the site a year ahead. If you haven't planted grapes yet, now this is your year to prep so that you're ready to plant next year. In the best case scenario, you want to run your rows of grapes in a north-south orientation. So this allows for the best sun exposure for your grapevines. And know also that grapevines take a wide range of soil pHs, but it would be best if they're under 8, which most of our native soils, you're fine with that. It's nothing to be concerned about. You're also going to want to spend this year removing all weeds from that area. You don't want them competing with your young grapevines. If you're not familiar with the area in which you're growing, maybe if it's a new property to you, or you would just like for your own information to know, you can have a soil test done of the area. And that is going to tell you if anything in particular nutrient-wise needs to be added to your soil before you do your planting. You do want to have an area that is well drained. So this is where that observation comes in. If you've had a heavy rain or our snowfall recently, how does that area drain? Is it still mucky, or has it all the water come through? Also, think about the frost in the area. The area that you're thinking about planting, is that the last area that thaws from frost in the winter? That might not be the best for a grape that is not as resistant to cold injury, depending on your variety. So look at all of those types of things. And then lastly, I wanted to point out this picture that we have here. Our last diagram showed a cordon trained grapevine. Here is a cane pruned grapevine. So you're going to see the trunk, the woody trunk there coming up, and then at the head of the trunk, those smaller growths are the canes. So those were shoots last year. This year they're canes. And so there's just different types of training and pruning methods depending on the variety of grape you're growing. Next, please. So when it comes to growing your own vines, your options are to purchase grapevines. You can purchase those as bare root plants, which means that they're in a dormant state, or you can purchase them as potted plants. And by Washington state law, it is law that you purchase only certified clean plants from nurseries. So we have that law because, as I mentioned earlier, grapes are an important commercial crop for our state, and we don't want to run the risk of bringing in any viruses or diseases that could be transferred to some of our commercial crop areas. You can propagate cuttings from healthy grapes. So if you choose and you have a neighbor or a friend or a family member who is growing grapes and they're a grape variety that you like, you can take a cutting from their grapevines, but I would encourage you to only take from healthy, vigorous vines, because you run the risk of bringing home any problems when you take cuttings from unhealthy vines. So to do that, you would take a small cutting and you're going to leave it in a, so in the dormant season when you're pruning, you'll take a cutting off of that plant, you'll leave it in a pot of potting soil for a full year, and you're going to want to look for healthy root growth at the end of the year. And then you get to plant that in your yard. So it is pretty simple. They root really well. There's nothing too fancy that needs to be done for that to happen. With your American cultivars, when you're planting them, it's recommended that they are spaced 6 to 8 feet apart per plant. In my experience, I would say minimum 8 feet. I planted mine 6 feet apart, and it was way too close for the variety that I was growing and for the soil I was growing in. 8 feet would have been much better. If you're planting more than one row, have 9 to 10 feet between rows. Again, think about these grapevines that grow 15, 20 feet if they're in the right kind of soil. So give them the space that they need. This is also the time you're going to want to make plans for your trellising system that you'll use for your grapevines. Next slide. So you've purchased your plant, you're ready to put it in the ground, you found your site. What are you going to do? What are the steps? So at planting time, you're going to prune off all but one vigorous 1-year-old cane. A lot of times when you buy a grape plant, it's going to have multiple vines on it. So choose one to keep that will become your trunk. Prune the cane back to 2 buds. And then you're going to run a training wire from that small little cane up to the top of your training wire. And your year 1 goal is to establish a healthy root zone and a trunk. And that's it. Ideally, your planted grapevine will reach your training wire in year 1. It doesn't always, it depends on the vigor of the vine. More often than not, it does. But year 1, ideally it would reach that training wire. If it doesn't, it'll reach it in year 2. And then through the year, you're going to, or through that first growing season, remove any side shoots that start showing up so that you're really focused on just getting the trunk and the root growth established. And you won't be seeing any fruit in that first planting year, obviously, because you want trunks and roots is it. Year 2, maybe, but more likely year 3 is when you'll get your first fruit production. Next slide, please. So how do you manage your grapevines so that they're successful once they've been planted? Well, keep them moist without overwatering. The roots don't like to be sitting in mucky, overwatered soil. Remember that your young plants are especially at risk. They've gone through some stress being planted. They're easy to be nibbled on by deer or rabbits, so you're going to want to be able to provide some protection for them. And they're like little babies in your garden, so pay attention to them. 1/2 inch to 1 inch of water per week is ideal with your newly planted grapes. If you can do drip irrigation, that would be fantastic. If not, watering by hand at the base of the plant is best. I would avoid all overhead watering if possible. You run the risk of introducing some diseases if you overhead water. But mostly just inspect your vines once you've planted them. Don't just put them in the ground and walk away for the summer and not pay attention to them. Does your young vine need to be retied to the training wire? Sometimes the wind might knock it off of the training string that you have going up to that wire and it needs to be retied, or it's grown more and it needs more support. Pay attention to the watering. Is it getting enough water? Is the soil too dry or too wet? Remember that in this first year or 2 with your grapevine, you're setting it up for 50 years of fruit production. So I would give it the attention that it needs. When you're planting, you're going to want to fertilize with 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce of nitrogen that first planting year per plant. And then in following years, you would fertilize sparingly. At that point, you're going to pay attention to your plant and see what it needs. You're also going to want to keep that row free of weeds. Again, weeds compete with those young grapevines, and you really want your grapevines to be your primary grower, not your weeds. In the future, mature grapevines that are grown on our clay loam soils like we have here in the Pacific Northwest for the most part can often grow without much supplemental irrigation, but you would want to watch during the long hot dry spells that we get in the summer, as well as when it's getting near fruit ripening time. So, mid-July, August into September, that's when you're going to want to pay attention to watering for your mature grapevines. Next slide. So a little bit more on the specifics of fertilizer. I had recommended that you fertilize your new plantings with 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce of nitrogen in the planting year. And then in the second year, you can fertilize with 1 to 1.5 ounces of nitrogen per plant. But what does that really mean? So nitrogen, when you're looking at a bag of fertilizer, nitrogen is the first number listed on that bag. Often you're going to see 3 numbers. So in the example of the blood meal here, nitrogen is the only number listed. There isn't any potassium or phosphorus in this in blood meal, or not enough to be noted. So this would be a good example of a nitrogen fertilizer that could be used in your grapevine plantings. When you do fertilize, you're not going to want to put it right up against the trunk. You're going to want to scatter that fertilizer around the trunk zone about 6 to 18 inches away from the trunk. And you'll want to fertilize around bud break. So paying attention to your vines, the ones that have been established, that is, but paying attention to those and fertilizing at that point. And you might see in some sources or just some general gardening advice that you apply a balanced fertilizer annually to get this desired amount of nitrogen for your grape plants. But here in Clark County, our native soil typically doesn't need the extra amendments of the potassium and the phosphorus. And so unless you have a soil test telling you otherwise, we really only recommend adding nitrogen as an amendment. In our area, the nitrogen in the soils tends to get leached away by our heavy rains, and that's why we do advise the addition of nitrogen. And in reality, grapes are not heavy feeders, and often they show more problems of being overfed rather than underfed by amendments. So watch your plants. This is, again, part of growing something is observing it. Are the leaves green and vibrant? It's probably doing really well. Is the vine showing good growth? It's a good sign for you. If those things are happening, then err on the side of using less of an amendment that year. Thank you. Next slide. So the last thing to look at is the possibility of encountering some issues with your grapevines. If you've done a lot of the preparation steps of good site selection and having good sun exposure and having good air circulation and an appropriate variety for your area, you'll automatically set yourself up to encounter less of these issues, but some things will still happen. You're still going to have birds coming into your garden and nibbling on your grapes, or raccoons, or deer. Weeds will still crop up anywhere. So you can't avoid all problems, but it's important to know when you're heading down the road of growing grapes of which problems are potential to happen for you. In my experience, my biggest issue with growing grapes was the birds. So I would get them, our grapes would be just about ready to pick. And then in one night, either the birds or the raccoons would have stripped my vines bare of grapes. So at that point, using some netting would have been advisable. If you live out in the country or a more rural area where deer come through, you're going to want to have them fenced off so that the deer are not going to get to them. Common issues that we see in the answer clinic when it comes to table grapes would be the mites. There are grape erinium mites. They cause fuzzy spots on the underside of leaves, and they're fairly common in this area. So those are something to look out for. And powdery mildew is another one. I'm sure if any of you have had a vegetable garden, you might have had some of your squash experience powdery mildew, or I've even seen it on lilac. So it just kind of depends. But that is something that grapes might be prone to. And good site selection and that north-south orientation, as well as pruning, helps limit some of those issues. But any of these, a good resource from OSU or WSU would explain further these different potential problems, as well as we're always available in the answer clinic to answer any other questions or help find resources for you if you're dealing with any of these. Thank you. Next slide.
I think we're going to take a short break. Eric, are you there?
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break between the two topics. Stuart, this will give folks, this will give you a chance maybe to stop and start the PowerPoint, because we seem to have a gray bar on the right side.
Okay, let me hide the floating panel and perhaps that
so
may
if
be
if folks, oh, you did it. Okay, if folks want to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, we'll resume in just a couple minutes.
I hope it wasn't there the whole time.
It was. I sent you a message.
Okay. Sorry.
But luckily, it wasn't too problematic. So Bekah and Stuart, if you guys want to look through the questions and see if maybe there's one or two that you'd like to answer when we come back, that would be great.
Gray bar on the side there. I had my video panel open, and apparently you cannot do that when you're sharing your screen. So I learned something today, and thanks for your patience. I apologize to Bekah for that. Bekah, thank you. Great information. So much I can see from the questions that there's so much we could cover that we're not getting to, but in an hour and a half, you can't do it all. My part of the presentation will focus on pruning and training. And these are the points that I'd like to cover in my time. Since we can't be in person, I'll show you a couple of short videos and give you a real life example from my own backyard. We're providing an overview, and folks, you're encouraged to go out and do research. Jot down some notes from this. I believe we'll make this presentation available to you. And if you have more questions, do some research, and you can trust sources from universities and some of the grape industry or the wine industry as well. But when you go down the industry side, it can get really complicated, probably more than you need for your home garden. So be careful with that. But again, from Maine, I mean Maine on the East Coast to Portland on the West Coast, you'll find grapes and information from universities that can help you. I want to point out this picture before we move on. The top is a commercial vineyard. It's the picture Bekah had up of a vertical shoot positioning, cane pruned wine grape. Okay, but look how much they took off. Between the rows are the vines they took off. This is, the canes that they replaced for the current year. And we'll talk about pruning a little bit more. One last thing, I'd like to encourage you to take hands-on classes as soon as we can do that. We can talk all we want about pruning, but until you get your hands on a pair of shears and get out there, it's going to be tough for you to get a feel for it. I'll do it this way. There we go. Pruning Philosophy 101. And for me, if I'm looking at that vine and I'm panicking, I need to step back a little bit, take a deep breath. So I hope when you look at your abandoned vines, and I already saw some questions about old grapevines, that you don't panic. There is a way to get them under control. And once you get them under control, it's a lot easier. So I wish you that spirit of learning and adventure. Wanted to go through a quick review of the terminology and the shape of the vine in relation to pruning, okay? So when we talk about the suckers, let's start at the bottom and work up. Bekah said that water sprouts, typically we remove. Well, that's true. But what if you want to replace your trunk? Say you've got a damaged trunk or your trunk is dying. You can use one of those suckers to actually replace your vine. It'll take a few years, as Bekah said, to get going, but you can do that. Now this shows a cordon, so we know that this is a spur pruned vine, because on a cane pruned vine, you don't have a cordon, and we'll talk about that. But remember, all of this woody wood, the cordon and the trunk, is not where you're going to get your fruit. Your fruit comes from the spurs, which are the canes in the first year, and that new growth, the shoots, which produce the grapes. So you've got to, when we're pruning, we're trying to maximize for that current year's growth so that we can get fruit that grows from that growth. Everything else is just to get us to that point. That's why you take off, as Bekah said, well, I'll tell you more, 75 to 90% of the vine every time you prune. So if I can get that one point across, that grapes only bear fruit on the current year's growth, which is produced on the previous year's canes or from spurs, that will be a success for me. Why do we prune? Space, light, air, and balance. As you dig into the literature more and more, you'll find that balance is a term that we use a lot. The reason is there's a lot of moving parts in the grapevine, right? You've got your vines growing up, you got your trunks, you've got sprouts and suckers and all these things going on. If you get too much of one thing, you're gonna suffer in another area. So this vine that you're looking at here on the right, probably more than 10 feet long. This vine's been neglected a bit. Where do you think the fruit is on that vine? It's right out at the tip, okay? So all that energy is going in to create that cane from year to year, extend it out further to produce a little bit of fruit at the end. That's not what I want. I want to optimize fruit production. I want to balance my vegetative and fruiting growth, and I want to manage for my own space and the health of the plant. I have a little trellis out there. I don't want that thing weighted down with all these vines. I want to take charge. As Bekah said, a single vine can take up to 50 square feet, and they can live for more than 120 years. I'm just going to state this. Some pruners in the commercial industry, when they start pruning a mess like this, they will weigh the amount of wood that they take off of the vine, and they'll actually use a little scale and hold it up and weigh it, which informs them as to how many buds to leave on the plant. It's a measure of the vigor of the plant, okay? As your buds start to show up closer and closer on those canes and you get good, healthy growth, you're probably going to end up taking off less or more. I don't know, depends on your plant. But the point being, you can balance the number of buds with the leaf growth, with the vine growth, and get a better fruit production. We're not going to go into balanced pruning today other than to mention it. For pruning, you're not going to need a lot of tools. It's pretty simple, especially in the second year when you get things under control. But they are vigorous growers. Your pruning should not take more than 15 to 20 minutes per plant. When you're talking about commercial growing, that's a different story. They actually use machines for pieces of part of it. For the harvest, they use machines for some of the leaf thinning that they do, just to mechanize the process and make it fast. But for you, you're going to need the pruning shears, the bypass type only, okay? Bypass versus anvil. And most of the master gardeners got that in the training pretty well. You don't want to smash the vines, you want to cut them off. So pruning shears probably will only be necessary in your first year of pruning. You'll probably just go to the hand shears from then on. You'll need loppers. I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong. Loppers, you probably only need the first year. The pruning shears you'll need every year. Handsaw if you get into taking out a trunk or a large cordon. And you always want to sanitize your tools. We've talked about this enough. Lysol will work, although it doesn't come in grape flavor. And you want to keep them sharp and sanitary. I've learned to wear eye protection and wear gloves when I'm pruning because those vines can whip around. When you're pulling them out, you're just going to yank them out. And you'll see in the video that I show you. And they can pop back and get you. Remember that fruit is only born on the one-year-old wood off of shoots. So you're taking off 75 to 90% of the wood from last year, okay? Through pruning, we're encouraging the right balance of the growth, and you need to do it every single year. So you keep your vine under control every year. All of the discussions that I hear from people are, I have these old vines that never got pruned. Well, here's your chance. Once you get it taken care of and in shape, you can minimize your need for time. Like I said, 15 to 20 minutes per vine. But you do want to do it during the dormant season, January to March. You can do it as late as April for some varieties. You don't want to do it too early, especially here. We just had a frost last week. If I had pruned prior to that frost, I might have gotten some damage on my vines. So what's the biggest problem? Well, we don't prune enough. We have to prune every year to avoid what you're seeing here. These were my concords when I moved on to my property. And if it's abandoned, you're going to be working a lot harder than if you do it every year. Don't be afraid to cut. Vines are very resilient. The picture on the right shows that they will go wherever they can go. As Bekah said, over the barn, I had this up in an apple tree. It went right through the fence. If you're consistent and prune every year, you're going to get your vine what we call under control. And you'll see some ideas on how you can control and train your vines. It's also make plants healthier. How much energy do you think is going into all that tangle on the bottom there that could be going into the shoot production and the fruit production? Think about that. So when you prune, you have an opportunity to create the shape of the plant. Some of these systems that you're looking at here are ancient. They've been around for thousands of years. Vines typically require a structure. You don't want to grow them on the ground, but there are some ways to prune where you don't need a structure, and you'll see that in a little video we'll show you. Trellis, gazebo, arbor, fence, barn, wherever it is, as Bekah says, the neighbor's yard, they will be there. We prune to the chosen shape, and what I really want to get across here is that you can pick one and go for it. The vine will forgive you. Looking at a couple of these, you're going to see down in the bottom row in the middle, the goblet or head variety. You're going to see what this looks like in an old vine. Now, this happens to be one of those forms of pruning where you don't need a structure. You can see the structures in the others, and in fact, the whole top row would have a wire supporting those canes or cordons, right? So you would need structure there. But we're pruning it to this shape, and that's what this slide is telling you. Let's focus in on two types of pruning that we do most often, okay? That's cane pruning and spur pruning. Example on cane pruning is my Concords. They should have been cane pruned from, early days, but they never were pruned properly. What cane pruning does is cutting back nearly all the vines prior growth, but leaves two canes. And I think Bekah showed you that in the first picture, one of the first pictures she showed you. And you leave some renewal spurs that will provide your canes for the next year. So really don't have much old wood on cane pruning. You got your trunk and you got a few spurs, you got the head of the trunk, and then the two canes, that's it. In spur pruning, the example below, an example for this type of pruning would be your Reliance grape. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Reliance is a hybrid. I have to look that up. But you're going to keep not only the trunk, but you keep your cordons, okay? A cordon is basically a cane that has been allowed to grow year to year and become woody. So the woody parts of your spur pruned vine will be your cordons and your trunk, okay? Out of that cordon will come the spurs, and you'll see the little picture of the spurs there. Basically, that's the end piece of a cane, right? And on that end piece of the cane, or that spur, there'll be 1 to 3 buds. Each bud can produce a cane that has the potential for producing fruit on shoots. And again, as Bekah said, those buds are compound. They can produce more than one shoot. And we'll talk about shoot thinning a little bit as we get on to this. Let's take a look at what it really looks like when you cane prune. This short video from Dr. Skinkiss of OSU shows an example of a well-pruned cane pruned vine. This is a commercial operation. I want you to note that. And as you look at it, you'll see they're using something called VSP. And I mentioned that, I think, vertical shoot positioning. We'll talk about it in a minute after the video too, but basically you're training your canes to go up, right? Or your shoots to go up on your vine rather than to just hang. So some you just let hang from the wire, some you train up, and in the commercial side, you'll see a bit of that hanging up. So let's see if we can get this video going. One thing I want to ask you to do is turn your volume up if you can't hear it. There's some wind going on out there, and her volume isn't the best ever. So let's see what happens here.
Okay, so we are going to do some pruning of grapevines today, and we're going to start out with one of two ways to prune. We'll start out with cane pruning. So we have a couple of things that we need whenever we do pruning, especially for cane pruning. We need a loppers and a hand pruners, as well as safety wear for your eyes. So this can be sunglasses or safety glasses in the vineyard. And a couple of things also when you're pruning is you want to make sure that you have a scale for weighing your prunings, as well as a rope that you can gather your prunings with. So we are going to do cane pruning of a vertically shoot positioned bilateral cane system today. And whenever we do pruning of a system like this, we have to look at renewing back to our renewal zone, and that's the head of this trunk. The top of the trunk is the head where all of our shoots originate from. Here is last year's cane that was laid down, and from that grows the shoots that we had last season. So this season we have to come in, we're going to remove about 90% of the vine in doing this, and we're going to select 2 new canes to lay out. So that means that we have to select those from this head area of the vine. So by looking at this, we want to choose 2 nicely formed shoots that are no smaller than the pencil diameter and has nice display of buds along the shoot. So right here, closest to the head, are 2 nice canes that came out last year. We have another nice one right here that we could use. So this old one from last year can come out completely. So I'm going to cut that out right here. And all of this down here has to be removed from the trellis. And you can do that by just grabbing and pulling firmly. So we have a shoot right here that grew last year. We've got one right here. We've got a lot of nice ones in the head, so we can remove the other cane over here. So now we're down to where we need to make our decision on what we want to prune back. So we know we have to lay out 2 canes, and we always prune back to 1-year-old wood. This is all 1-year-old wood here. The canes from last year that were laid out last spring are actually 2-year-old wood. We don't want that. So we're going to lay out 2 canes. This one is nicely positioned. However, some of the internodes are quite long. So we have some others that we can choose from that might have a shorter internode space. So this one right here might be a good choice for laying out onto the wire. And this one over here will be my choice for laying onto this side of the wire. So that leaves us to tipping and tying the shoot. I'm going to cut it off at a node about halfway to the point of the next vine space. I'm just going to wrap it around the trellis wire here for now, but we can tip and tie that later. And with this one right here, I'm going to do the same. Just wrap it around the wire. Usually just needs to be once. But I just want it to hold right now. And we see that we have a number of shoots in the head here that we want to take care of. We don't need all of these. We've got our cane out here, a cane out there. We can actually choose to leave just 2 shoots, so we can take out the other 2, so this one we won't need. And let's take out this one right here and leave 2 of them that are in the center or the head of the vine. And when we're doing this, now we have our 2 canes, we have 2 extra shoots here. What we're going to do is cut those back to either 2 bud spurs, or we can leave them. In this case of a frosty vineyard, or a vineyard that has a spring frost, we will actually maybe want to leave these 2 as full canes until the early part of spring, because they'll be serving as kicker canes. Otherwise, we could come through and just cut those back to individual spurs, down to about 2 count buds. So after
Again, that was an example from a commercial vineyard, but the principles are the same for us, okay? For cane pruning, this is how it works every time. Note again that the vines were trained, the shoots were trained to go up on that variety. It could just as well have been high, higher 5 foot up with the canes hanging down. That's the hanging type. So it's all a matter of you deciding what you want to do. Okay. Let's take a look at a fun one. This is a little clip showing the goblet or head pruned vine. This is an ancient type of pruning, like I mentioned, and it does not require a trellis system. You can see on the picture here, it is staked up and the canes are just coming out of the head of the trunk. Pretty easy, huh? And it take up less space. Let's take a look at it.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Lax, and we're here in the middle of our state vineyard at 2,500 feet elevation in South El Dorado County in the Sierra foothills. And we planted our Zinfandel vines first vines back in 1992, and we decided to train them in the very traditional method of head training, just like all the other great old vine Zinfandels in California. These vines here are in their 26th growing season, and this is a classic example of a head-trained vine. You'll notice that all the growth comes out of this one central place, the head of the vine. This sort of traditional method for training grapevines is very, very efficient as far as requiring lack of trellising infrastructure. So basically all you need is a stick in the ground to train the vine up, and then as you flare out the head here, it can actually wind up standing on its own. A variety like Zinfandel does well with a little bit of sunlight coming through on it. Also, too, as the wind blows, it moves air through here, which prevents mold and mildew issues on the Zinfandel grape clusters, which is another great asset of head training. And it also makes these great, cool, gnarly-looking vines.
Oh, I love that guy. Great looking, gnarly vines. What fun. So those vines, you saw the thickness of those. They may be, 30, 40 years old. Who knows? I hope those videos helped you see that there are many, many varieties of pruning, ways you can train a vine. And really, once again, you're in charge. I want you to have the confidence to pick a design, pick a method of pruning and go for it. Let me show you a personal example from home. Last week, I pruned my Concord grapes. And this was a abandoned vine 2 years ago. When I moved into the property, it was up over, again, over the shed and into the apple tree. We took it back. We did what we called a severe pruning 2 years ago. Last year, I tried to do some spur pruning on it. Even though the literature said that Concords like the cane pruning, we thought we'd try the spur pruning. So we did, and I wasn't happy with the growth that I'm seeing throughout this vine. First of all, this cordon that you see tied off right in the middle of the screen there did not produce much in the way of growth. You can see one short little cane there and a few others, and I'm not happy with that cordon. So I've decided to take it out. Here are the cordons that we left last year. The one on the right is the one I will keep. The one on the left, I've decided to take out. Pruning is really a series of decisions, and you are the decision maker, okay? So it takes a little while to get your head around it, but once you do, start cutting, you'll be fine. So what I'm going to do is select a couple of canes. These are the two canes that I like. One is pretty far down on that old cordon, okay? It's pretty far down. I don't like that so much, so next year, I'll look for one that's a little further up, maybe on that spur that's up closer to the top. My goal is to get this trunk. This is the new trunk now, this cordon. Get that trunk so that's close to the top of the trellis system, and then have a couple, 4 good canes come out of the top of that every year. We'll see. So I get out my loppers, and there goes the big cordon, basically the trunk of the tree, right? And I'm creating a new trunk with the other cordon. I'm glad I did it, because as I cut that, I see this dead wood in there. Probably explains why I wasn't getting good growth out of that, out of the spurs that we left on that particular cordon. The other one looks really healthy, so I was happy that I made the right choice there. So I took off the other cordon, which is now my trunk. I took it off just above the 2 canes that I'm going to use for this year. And this is what the vine looks like. And you can wish me luck. I will be watching this, and maybe we'll do another presentation. I'll show you how it all turns out. You might think of training your grapevines as, like training a dog. Your pruning is your grooming, and your training is having your vine, having your dog react the same way and have a consistent behavior. So here's some ideas. There are many ways to do this. In the upper right is a single downward hanging canopy. So again, remember we talked about the vertical shoot positioning. Well, this is downward hanging. Those vines just hang off of that wire. The upper left is a decorative archway. I don't want to be the one to get up there and prune and harvest from that. Doesn't look like it's very easy to manage, but it sure is beautiful. You can grow grapes to be beautiful. You don't have to always grow them to get fruit. But in this case, I think that's what they were going for. The lower right is called a Geneva double curtain. It uses 2 wires. And these woody arms that you see that go out from both sides are typically spur pruned, but they can also be cane pruned. You might think of those arms as short cordons, okay? And then the canes come off of the head of those arms. And you get basically 4 canes using this method. So you get possibly a better production, bigger production, easy to harvest. I like that design. I wish I could do it. It does take a bit of space, as you see. Before you decide, I'm sorry, and then the bottom left is the vertical shoot positioning, what it looks like when it's growing. The same method that we saw in the video, the first video, that's what it looks like. And before you decide on your training system, sit back, pull up a chair, ask, is this the space where I want this vine? And as Bekah pointed out, they can live 150 years. Do I have the energy to maintain this and harvest from this system? And remember, you can change it up as years go by, just as I did. I went from spur pruning to cane pruning. Okay. A typical trellis, like the one you're looking at in the lower right, has posts that go into the ground. Remember that if you're going to build a trellis, and we're not going to get into the details of building one today, but if you're going to, it's got to be strong enough to support a lot of growth and a lot of heavy fruit. So your post will typically go 2 to 3 feet in the ground. You're going to use 12 gauge wire. This is a serious business to build a trellis properly. But it can be done, and it can be done on a scale that will work in your backyard. I've got a couple more slides, and I want to talk about one that I think you all might be interested in. And this is, what do you do with an old neglected vine? Well, when I showed up on my property, we did what we called severe pruning. Okay. Severe pruning is where you take off fully 90% of the vine. And on an overgrown vine, that's a lot of wood that comes off. You'll likely know when severe pruning is needed, because there'll be a lack of pruning for several years, and you'll know that. You'll have small fruit, too much vegetation, and you're just not getting the production out of it that you want. To do this, the first thing you want to ask is the plant worth saving? Do I want it? If not, take it out, put in another one. Bekah showed you a little bit of how to start a grape. In 5 years, you'll have a healthy plant. So think about that. Is the plant in the right place? Does it have sentimental value? Did my grandfather plant it? That's okay too, if you want to keep it. You want a good trunk, and you want a good framework. You want to also take some cuttings from that vine if you do like it, because severe pruning is hard on a plant, and they will probably come back. But if they don't come back, at least you'll have some cuttings to plant again if you want to. So you're basically, when you're doing a severe pruning, you're taking off 90% of the plant. You're basically leaving nothing but the trunk and 2 canes and 1 long cane with 40 buds. Now, why do you want to do that? It kind of buffers the impact on the plant to have some leaf growth and some pump, energy pump for that plant. So you'll leave that 1 long cane for a year as the plant grows and reestablishes new canes, and you have it under control the following year. Then you can take off that long cane. Okay. That's really, in a nutshell, how you do this. And the hardest part of this, folks, I will tell you, is standing there looking at it saying, where do I begin? Well, start from the bottom, take off those suckers, move up the trunk, and then start taking out everything but those 2 canes and the 1 long cane. That's how you start. It's hard, but you can do it. When you get into yearly, annual pruning, it's a lot easier. You've learned how to prune, you've pruned your vines well, and you're going in from year to year, doing it again between January and March. Cane pruning, you already learned you need to establish 2 canes, okay, for the shoot growth for that year. Spur pruning, you want to retain the spurs that you will use, the buds that are on those spurs to grow your shoots for that year. You want to take off your suckers. If your trunk is good and solid, you don't need to replace your trunk. Go ahead and take those suckers out anytime. This is a photo shoot thinning, okay? The idea here is that as we know, the buds are compound buds. They can have up to 3 shoots. Here you see 2 fruit clusters coming out of there. We want to select for the group of the cluster that looks the healthiest and has the best growth. So here you've got one that's hanging down and you've got one that's looking really nice and flowering. You probably want to keep that one, take the other one out. Okay. So 1 per bud is what your goal is. That will put the energy into that cluster and give you a better production, healthier fruit. Leaf pulling is something you do in the summer on the east side or the morning side of your plants. And you do that sparingly. You do it when you need to get sunlight into that plant. It helps with air circulation. It helps that sunlight dry off the plant, maybe helping with some of the powdery mildew issues. And you don't want to go crazy and just strip it on the east side, but just take out a few leaves and let it breathe. That's part of the balance. Now, you don't want to do it on the west side because you want that shading during the hot summer months, so you don't get a lot of drying or desiccation. Pruning wrap up. Well, you're in charge. You create the shape you want. Your vines will usually forgive you, and they are very resilient. You prune for light, air circulation, ease of access, and space. And you want to encourage growth of new canes where the fruit is. Get control of your vine in this year, and it'll be a lot easier in years as we go. Here's a couple of resources, and I know that Erica will make this available to you. The one that I've relied on most in my research is the Growing Table Grapes by Bernadine C. Strick. She's an excellent presenter, and there are many videos out there that she's done as well that you can find. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Erica and John to manage some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. That was wonderful. Let's bring John and Bekah up. And if you want to go ahead and put any final questions that you have into the chat box, we'll ask all 3 presenters to monitor that and maybe just pick a question or 2 and read the question and give us the answer. I do want to put in a quick plug while they're doing that to our answer clinic. If you have questions about your grapes or about getting started with grapes, there may be master gardeners who can help find information to share with you. Just email us at mganswerclinic@clark.wa.gov, and we can do a little bit of research and send you some information. So Stuart, Bekah, and John, if you see questions that you'd like to answer, go ahead.
I see one that's pretty easy. I'll go for the easy ones and leave the hard ones for these guys. The question, do spurs need to be renewed? And the answer is yes. You call it renewing when you allow that spur one internode's growth each year. So remember, internode is the distance between your buds. So your first year, your spurs are going to have maybe 2 buds on them. Okay. The next year, the cane's going to come out of one of those buds. You're going to cut that cane back, but you need to leave a bud on there, right? You need to leave those 2 buds again. So it's going to grow a little longer every year. So that's what you call renewal. You prune them back, but you don't prune them back right to the base because you want those canes to come out of your spurs. Anything else, you guys?
I think John and Karen have gone through and answered a lot of the previous ones.
We called in reinforcements. Thank you, Karen. That's great.
There are a couple of questions. Stuart, one, you mentioned pruning and frost, that you should not prune before a frost. Yeah. Could you explain that a little? Because I thought you were supposed to prune it while it's dormant, which means there will be hard freezes after you prune.
Yeah. I would look at your varieties again and see what they say, because some of them are more susceptible, as I understand it, to the damage from frost. And we're talking a pretty deep freeze, okay? Not just a little frost. You're exposing a cane, right, or a spur to elements. And if you've cut them, if you've done pruning before, you'll see that there's a seeping that happens at the end of the vine. That's perfectly normal. You can put your finger on it, it gets real sticky. What I think you don't want is for that deep freeze to come in and just split that right open, okay, and freeze it. So yeah, it's tricky to know exactly when, John. I don't have a guide. I do know that in our area, you can wait through March, right, to do your pruning if you need to. And it's probably better with some varieties. Again, look at your variety and see if it's susceptible to that kind of damage from frost. That's the best answer I have. I don't have any exact experience with that. My Concords have not had that problem. I've not seen any frost damage on them at all.
I think a lot of our American varieties are less susceptible to cold damage as well. So that might play part of it. We did have a question, Stuart, that I was hoping maybe you could answer. I had someone ask, they have an older vine or older grape plant and it has 2 trunks. Mm-hmm. Should she remove one of the trunks and just bring it down to a 1 trunk plant, or should she leave both of them? And you having renovated your own vines, I thought maybe you could address that.
Yeah, it comes back to why you're growing your grapes. If you're in the grape production side of it, and that's what you want more fruit, you might take one of the trunks out and focus the energy through 1 trunk and do your cane pruning. If you've got a decorative background and you think that you want more vegetation, you want it to look nice, a lot of people leave as multiple trunks, right? So you let it grow up on maybe on a trellis on the side of a barn or something. It looks really beautiful. But in that case, you're not growing it to get fruit, okay? You're growing it for the beauty of the plant. So you have to decide what it is you're growing it for. The typical recommendations, and John, you can correct me if I got this wrong, are to keep 1 trunk and to nurture that trunk, as Bekah said, from the early days when you stick a stick in the ground, that becomes your trunk. To nurture that so that you have a strong root system, a good solid single trunk, and canes or cordons to produce your new growth. Any other thoughts on that, John?
Yes, I think you hit it right on the head. I think the technique of having double vines comes from mostly northern climates, more north than we do, because during the training process, they're afraid that one will be frost damaged. And so that way you still have another one. Stuart, I think Bekah, we have a question about transplanting an old vine.
Right. In my experience with having an older vine, so for example, at our last property, we had older table grapes growing along the fence line and a windstorm took those grapevines out. and they were so established it would have been difficult to dig them up and transplant them. And I had better luck taking cuttings from those vines, the ones that I wanted to keep, and propagating them and then replanting them as new vines the following spring. So that's, if it's a very established vine that's going to have a large root zone you're dealing with, that's a big tangle of a mess to try and move. So I would recommend, if it's a vine that you want to continue growing, that you would do propagation instead.
And I've heard the same thing as well. And that deep root system, you can think in heavier soils like ours, it's probably still going to be 5 feet deep or something like that.
Or more. Yes, I think I was reading the majority of the roots are in the top 3 feet of the soil, but it can go down into 15, as far as 15 feet deep in some soils. So it'll be far less stressful for you and for the plant to just take cuttings. There was also a question about, it was directed to me, but I only on my grapes done cane training. So it was a difference between, I'm sorry, let me scroll back and find it, between a new cane and a spur. So I know like the new growth on a grapevine is called a shoot. And if it's remained through the growing season into the fall, it now becomes called a cane. It's kind of like when a road is winding down the street and at the turn, it changes the name, but you're still on the same road. So a shoot becomes a cane. But in spur pruning, how would you address that, Stuart? The difference between a new cane and a spur?
Yeah. A spur is basically the base of a cane, right? After you pruned it to 3 buds, two or 3 buds. So that's what that is. Buds produce the same thing no matter how you prune it, right? They produce shoots, which become canes in the second year, right? So that they all do the same. So it's just from the spurs, you might get 2 or 3, shoots coming out. If you just left that vine to go, you'd probably see those the following year and the following year and the following year growing up over your barn as canes, right? Does that make sense? It is a terminology that's kind of difficult to wrap your head around, but think of a shoot as the current year's growth. You can see it, it's green, it's more fragile, it's more susceptible to frost damage, whereas a cane is 1 year old and has a bunch of buds on it, which you're protecting those buds because those buds are going to burst forth, give you the shoots where the fruit will appear.
And on that note, I think I'd like to go ahead and close it out. We're starting to have people drop out. I want to thank our presenters, Stuart Campbell and Bekah Marten, and John Moore for helping to field questions. I did mention that the video will be available on our website. If you haven't been to our website, we have some great resources there. So I would encourage you to explore and see if you can find that video along with others. And before we say our goodbyes, I want to let you know that we've got a couple of other webinars coming up. On Monday, March 1st at 6:30, you're invited to join Master Gardener Vione Graham for an introductory workshop on mason bees. And on Monday, March 8th, we'll be offering Preparing Your Home and Landscape for Wildfire. Community Wildfire Preparedness Coordinator Ashley Blazina is going to join us and talk about tips for making your home and landscape more fire resilient. And then I want to just put a little teaser out there. Our small fruit team, which includes the 3 folks here, as well as Karen and Pam, are working on a brand new presentation on small fruits in the home garden, and that's going to be offered in April, so watch for that. And that's going to be everything that you want to know about small fruits that can be grown here, whether you're already growing them or thinking about what you can add to your garden. So again, thanks everyone for attending. Thanks to our presenters. Everyone have a great Saturday. Get out there and prune those grapes.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.